The end of Acts chapter 21 follows as anticipated and as prophesied. The Apostle Paul finds himself bound in chains. Now, as was reported in the meeting with James, many of the faithful Jewish Christians residing within Jerusalem believed that Paul was teaching the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to Jewish customs. Thus, when Paul went to worship at the temple, Jews from Asia, likely familiar with Paul from his time spent in Ephesus, stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Of course, it wasn't true. Paul had not done so, but mobs and rioters have never been particularly concerned with petty details such as the truth. Eventually, Roman soldiers intervened. The fortress of Antonia, named after Mark Antony, overlooked the temple. It was this fortress which the Gospels refer to as the Praetorium. Here Jesus was tried by Pilate. He was beaten by the Roman guard. It housed 600 men, and with towers of 115 feet high, it was quite easy for soldiers on watch to observe what was happening on the Temple Mount. A festival like Pentecost caused the population in Jerusalem to swell by 2 to 3 times as much. As such, the Roman soldiers were no doubt already on high alert. Witnessing the disturbance brought about by Paul's presence, they engaged. Well, at least they tried. It was a confusing mess. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. All the while, the mob continued in their efforts to rip him to pieces. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Well, that's certainly a case of mistaken identity, isn't it? The commander, clearly surprised by the well-speaking Paul, gave him the opportunity. And we'll probably spend time in the coming devotions unpacking Paul's message. There are 2 things that stand out first to me. Number 1 is this: much of the lead up to Paul's arrival in Jerusalem parallels Jesus' own journey. Paul follows the example of Jesus because he's led by the Spirit of Jesus. And yet at this point, the 2 stories diverge. Not only in their destination, where Jesus was killed in Jerusalem, Paul in Rome. Over the coming chapters, Paul will repeatedly address rulers and authorities, and he will defend himself. Jesus, as we're told in the gospel accounts, remained virtually silent in the interrogations with the rulers. How do we make sense of Paul modeling the life of Jesus so closely, so intentionally in so many other ways, and now deviating so significantly? The answer is that again and again, the defenses that we will read are not designed primarily to defend Paul, but to witness to Jesus. Paul opens his mouth and he speaks because that's what a witness does. Jesus came to save us from our sins. Paul was called, as you and I have been, to witness to that reality. Even in the midst of the mob being carried off by the Roman soldiers, Paul sees the opportunity. In verse 39, he asks, "Please let me speak to the people." I pray that you and I would be so eager and so opportunistic to witness as well. Have a blessed week.